Hey, if this is your first time with us, we are thrilled to have you. Welcome to Red Rock. If you're new, it's all good. Me too. At some point, I probably need to stop saying I'm new, but I'm only like a month and a half in, so I'm going to keep riding that train for a little bit longer, okay? But man, if you are new, we are just thrilled to have you here. Hope you love your experience. Hope to see you again. Hope we get to see your face more throughout the year. Before we jump into our message series today, I wanted to take just a second to address what's happening in our country tomorrow as we all pause and celebrate Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day. That we need to always be intentional about that day, man. Like, there's so many holidays in our country that we just kind of like have them and like let them go, and we don't really do anything intentional. But man, this is a moment where every year, and not just on this day, but all throughout the year, we need to be intentional about educating ourselves and educating our children on the issues of racism in our country that still exist, but have existed in the past. And we need to respect and honor the work that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. has done for our country and bringing us to where we are with the civil rights movement. And so, man, the reason this is so important for us as the church to always be intentional with and always be talking about, and always be mindful of, is that this is at the heart of God. Like, diversity is not a like politically correct thing. It's a God thing. Like, when we get to heaven, it's going to be full of people that don't look just like us, that don't look just like you, that don't talk just like you, that don't think just like you. It's going to be a very diverse mixture of people because God has created all kinds of different people and all kinds of different cultures. And so, man, let's celebrate it. Let's make sure that the church is a place where all people are welcome, all people are safe to belong. But then let's make sure it's a personal thing, that we've got relationships with people that don't look like us, friendships with people that don't think exactly like we do. So make sure you take tomorrow, make it a big day, do something intentional to celebrate it and to educate yourself, educate your kids, and let's make this a diverse church, all right? So we're in week 3 of a series called Better Question, a Better Question. If you got a Bible and you want to get to Luke chapter 20, Luke chapter 20 is where we're going to be. We've been there all month long. If you don't have a Bible, no sweat. We'll have the words on the screen for you. But to kind of get our heads thinking that way, our hearts thinking the right way, I want to ask you a question. By show of hands, how many math nerds we got in the house? Math nerds. Shout out to numbers. I don't know about like where you are. Like for me, when I was in high school, students in the room, you can probably relate to this right now. Those of us that are years beyond, hearken back to your younger days when you were a student, and you know that there were things that you took classes on, things that you were educated on, that you knew for a fact in the moment you would never use this for the rest of your life, right? Like you knew, like I'm telling you, I'm still waiting for the day as an adult where I need to know the difference between a stalactite and a stalagmite. That is not, like geology is not if you're a geology teacher, I'm very sorry, but that's just not something we like really use a whole lot, man. I'm still waiting on that one. But numbers and math I knew. Like numbers and math are like very useful. You know you're going to need to learn math because you're going to need how to calculate a budget, calculate a paycheck. Like numbers matter, so like you knew that this was a useful subject. Except for when math did one thing. There's one part of math that I hated with every fiber of my being, and that was word problems. How many of you guys remember word problems? Oh my gosh, like Sally has 6 apples, and she wants to give all of her imaginary friends 2 apples, and so she goes and buys 20 apples, so how many imaginary friends does Sally have? Who cares, right? Like, let's ask a better question. Why does Sally have imaginary friends, and why is she giving them apples? Like, there are better questions to be asking here, people. This does not matter. I saw this thing on social media a couple weeks ago about word problems, and I died laughing. I had to share it with you. It says this, why I hate math. I hate math tests because all through the chapter, it's like really easy, and then you think you've got it, and then the test is like, if I throw a triangle out of the car's going 20 miles an hour, and wind resistance is a thing that exists, how many cupcakes can Pedro buy with one human soul? I mean, that's like how much sense they make, right? This is crazy. Now, the reason we're talking about word problems today is that what we're going to read in Luke chapter 20 is Jesus getting hit with a word problem, all right? And like when you read it, you're like, that is so crazy. It literally sounds just like a word problem that you would get in math. It sounds crazy, it's hypothetical, it's not rooted in reality whatsoever. But the important thing for us today is to see the correlation between this hypothetical question that Jesus gets hit with and the types of questions that we actually ask of God. That we actually come to find out that we ask very similar questions of God. And Jesus' response to this word problem is so powerful. It is so transforming that I believe that it has the power to change your life. The way he responds to this seemingly insignificant hypothetical word problem I think it can change your life. If you're here and you wouldn't believe you wouldn't call yourself a Christian, you wouldn't consider yourself a follower of Jesus. If you're here and you've been in church all your life, I think the way that Jesus responds and the better question that he gives us to ask has the power to change your life. And so we're going to jump in. Luke chapter 20, starting in verse 27. Y'all ready? Gosh, man. Y'all going to learn when I say y'all ready. If you don't say, yeah, ready or something, there we go. I'm just going to keep like shaming you into it, all right? Luke chapter 20, starting in verse 27. The words are on the screen for you if you need them. Here we go. It says, then Jesus was approached by some Sadducees, religious leaders who say there is no resurrection from the dead. And they posed this question. Teacher, Moses gave us a law that if a man dies, leaving a wife but no children, that his brother should marry the widow and have a child who will carry on the brother's name. Now pause for a second, because we just went like 21st century America, hard right turn into first century Judaism, right? Hard turn. Now, and you need to know, like context-wise, Luke chapter 20 is an entire chapter of Jesus getting hit with really hard questions that were intended to trap him. That these religious leaders didn't like that Jesus was like the new guy in town and like everyone wanted to hear from him. Like, so they're trying to take his power away because used to everyone came to them trying to learn like who God is and what he's like. And now no one wants to hear from them. They all want to hear from Jesus. And so they're trying to lay these traps for him with these difficult questions. And so this week we get introduced to a new brand of religious leader. Okay, the past 2 weeks, it's been the Pharisees. Now we get introduced to a new denomination of religious leader known as the Sadducees, all right? The Sadducees. And Luke includes a detail that is key for us to understand, from, again, going from 21st century perspective to first century perspective. He says, what you need to know is that the Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection, meaning that they don't believe there's life after death. They believe that God deals with the physical world only, and that once you die, it's over. I had a Bible college professor back in the day who said that this is why they're called the Sadducees. They don't believe in life after death, which is why they're sad, you see? Man, I dropped that class the next day, man. That was brutal. I can't take that. But it stuck with me. Right? They're sad because they don't believe in life after death. And that's important to understand as we go into the question. Now, when they get into, they lay the groundwork for the question, referencing this Old Testament law that says that if a man is married and they don't have kids, that the brother-in-law should marry the woman and have kids. And that's just like super weird, right? Because we think of like marriage from a 21st century perspective. Marriage is about love and relationship and intimacy and romance. But very different, because I know what some of y'all are thinking right now. Some of y'all ladies in the house are like, I have to marry my brother-in-law if this dude dies? Like, I would never marry my brother-in-law. That would be like absolutely crazy. But you need to understand, that's not how they saw marriage. In the first century and in the Old Testament, marriage was way more of a social construct intended to protect the family unit. So think about this. There's a husband and a wife, and that husband has received some property from his father, so an inheritance from his father, some wealth. And now if he dies and doesn't have a kid to pass it on to, then we need to keep that property and keep that wealth in the family. So the brother should marry and have a child and keep the generational passing of wealth smooth. So this is how they viewed marriage. And it's very important because the question that they're going to drop is going to get real tricky for us if you don't remember that aspect of marriage. Here comes the word problem, all right? It even sounds like a word problem. It sounds like 10th grade algebra just entered the room. Here it is, next verse. Well, suppose there were 7 brothers. I mean, it's like, that's the beginning of the test question. Suppose there were 7 brothers. The oldest one married and then died without children. So the second brother married the widow, but he also died. And then the third brother married her. And this continued with all 7 of them who died without children. These poor guys are dropping like flies. You think like, is the wife poisoning them? Like, what is happening here? There's got to be some chaos happening. But then it says, finally, the woman also died. So here's the problem. Tell us, whose wife will she be in the resurrection? For all 7 were married to her. All right, and again, you can't think about this from our 21st century perspective, because you read this as like a modern day person. You're thinking, is this the Bachelorette in heaven? Is this like one woman, a house full of guys? Who will she choose? No, this is not that. You got to think about this from the terms of the property. And this is where it gets really ugly. Because the question that they're really asking is not about who gets the land, not about who gets the wealth, it's about who gets the woman. They viewed women, they devalued women so much that in this equation, women were property. And I know all of you are like, oh my gosh, why did I come to church today? But don't worry, because when Jesus responds, he's going to address that part of it. But we got to back up for a second, because before we get to Jesus' response, we need to observe something that's happening. The Sadducees have come in, and they are asking a hypothetical question that they believe proves their already held opinions about God. They think that this question proves that there is no life after death. Because if there were life after death, how could you solve this transfer of property problem that we have? See, this proves for them what they already believe. They were using this hypothetical question that they couldn't wrap their minds around as a way to stiff-arm God and keep him at a distance. And this is where we have more in common with the first century religious leaders than we'd like to admit. We don't call ourselves Sadducees, but we got some stuff in common with them. Because we do the same thing. We all do the same thing. I did this. I mean, I still at times struggle with this. You think of a hypothetical question that you can't quite understand, you can't quite wrap your mind around. It doesn't make like logical sense to you or me. And so we use that as a way to stiff-arm God. See, we ask this question all the time when it comes to the conversation about of faith in God. We ask this: what about them? What about them? You ever had a what about them question? You're thinking like, okay, wait. If Jesus is real, if this whole thing is true, and like Jesus is the only way to God, what about the island of people who have never had a Bible, have never heard of Jesus? Like, what about them? Doesn't make any sense. So you can kind of stiff-arm God with it. You think, well, what about life on other planets? What if there's life out there and they've never heard of Jesus and they don't get a Bible? What about them? Or maybe make it a little bit more real. What we typically do is we look at someone else's story, a real story, but we just don't really know them. And we say, like, how could God allow that to happen? Like, what about them? What about the mom and dad that lost their child to cancer? How is that fair? Like, what about them? Or like, you look at kids across the world that are suffering and are hungry and have no food and have no shelter. You think, well, what about them? How is that fair, God? What about them? And we use these hypothetical questions. Again, I'm not pointing the finger at you. I'm saying I did this. I didn't grow up in church. I didn't grow up believing in Jesus with plans to be a preacher. When I first started coming into this whole faith conversation, I used these questions to say, man, I don't need to give faith a chance. I don't need to give church a chance. I don't need to give Jesus a chance, because these what about them questions make no sense. And surely if God exists, it would make sense to us. We would be able to understand these difficult questions. That's what the Sadducees are doing. They're putting Jesus in this hypothetical question. Now, the way Jesus responds is so powerful. It is so intriguing. He answers their specific question about marriage, but then he does something so much bigger, and it has the power to change your life. Look at how he responds in the next verse. Here's Jesus' response to the word problem. It says, marriage is for people here on earth, but in the age to come, those worthy of being raised from the dead will neither marry nor be given in marriage, and they will never die again. In this respect, they will be like angels. They are children of God and children of the resurrection. Now pause. He says, okay, so your question about marriage in heaven, here's the deal. Marriage is for here. Marriage is for this place, earth. But when you get to the next life, when you get to heaven, marriage is not like this. People will neither marry nor be given in marriage. And again, try your hardest to not think 21st century, because there's some of you in the room that are like, I don't get to be with my husband or wife forever. Like when we tied the knot, this was a forever thing. We said forever. We did the unity sand. We did the unity candle. We tied a big knot at our wedding. It's forever, okay? If heaven doesn't have my boo thing, I don't want to be there. And then some of you are like, there's an end in sight? Like, good to know. Good to know. I was just wondering. I didn't know. You know? I'm kidding. You're not like that. You love each other. But do you? That's not what Jesus is talking about. Jesus is not providing commentary on if you're going to have this special relationship with your spouse when you get to heaven. No. We don't actually know much about heaven from Jesus' teachings. The only things we know for sure is it's going to be incredible and he's going to be there. And that's what makes it incredible, is that he's going to be there. And he's the most loving, incredible person ever, and so love's going to be there. So there's no reason to think that you're not going to have special relationships and friendships with your family and your loved ones, all that. He's not talking about that. Remember, he's talking about property. And he says exactly what we as enlightened 21st century Americans would want him to say all the way back in the first century. He says, hey, here's the deal. Marriage is for here. That's how it works here right now. In the age to come, people neither marry nor are they given in marriage. Translation, in heaven, people aren't property. And all of God's people said, amen. That's a good thing, right? People aren't property. We should celebrate this, that Jesus has a very enlightened, progressive response as people are not property. But Jesus is about to do something so much more important than answering a question about marriage. He's about to pull the whole thing up. And he's about to get real with it, because look what happens in the next verse. He says, but now, as to whether the dead will be raised, even Moses proved this when he wrote about the burning bush. We'll talk about this in a second. Long after Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had died, he referred to the Lord as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. So he is the God of the living, not the dead, for they're all alive to him. Now, if you didn't grow up in church, that's all right. If you don't know the story of Moses and the burning bush, like what in the world did we just enter into? You don't need to, that's a different sermon for a different day. What you need to know is that there was this account of a great important leader in Jewish history named Moses, and he encountered God in a really miraculous way. And afterwards, he started referring to God, after this incredible encounter, as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, three important leaders who had all died. And he says that, but to God, they're not dead. He's the God of the living, not the God of the dead. See, there is life after death. But what's more important for us to consider is what Jesus did here, the bigger picture move that he just made. Because Jesus just went from a hypothetical question with not real people, not real circumstances, not real names, and he changed it to a personal situation, a real situation with real names. He said he's the God of Abraham, a real person with real regrets, with real mistakes, and with real faith. He's the God of Isaac, a real person with real issues, real faith. And he's the God of Jacob, a real person, not a hypothetical, not maybe, no, a real person. See, he completely takes the hypothetical out of it and says, no, we need to get personal. We need to get real with this. Because Jesus knew that when it comes to these big questions of faith and what's really important in life, Jesus knew that hypothetical questions just really aren't that helpful. They might be fun to think about, they might be intriguing, but they aren't really helpful when it comes to discovering the truth. My 8-year-old son, Emmett, he asked probably my favorite hypothetical question of all time a few months ago. We're sitting in the car, we're driving along, and we weren't talking about careers. We weren't talking about, what do you want to be when you grow up, son? It's just out of nowhere. He says, hey, Dad, I got a question. When I get older, should I be a professional football player first or a rapper? I said, you are literally thinking about the life that I wish I had, okay? So I just tried to real talk with him. I'm like, hey, I'll enter this hypothetical question, sure. I said, son, here's what you need to do. You need to be a professional football player in your 20s. Use your body in its peak, prime years. Take the punishment, take the beating. Then be a rapper in your 30s, 40s, and 50s and ride that train on out, okay? He's like, okay, cool. Then he asked another question. He goes, okay, I got that, Dad. Professional football player first. But can I be a rapper and a preacher at the same time? I was like, you are literally describing the life I've always wanted. Right there. You did it. Okay? You did it. But it's a hypothetical question. Come on, that's not rooted in reality, okay? None of those options are all that viable. Preacher, maybe. I don't come from a family of preachers. This might be a one-off in the Kinder family tree. And I know the Kinder DNA, okay? The Kinder DNA, we got some soul, we got some rhythm, but we ain't got the flow to be a rapper. And football player? The Kinder DNA is short and slow. It is not a professional athletic career in our future. I'm trying to get him to move out of the hypothetical. Let's go accounting. Let's go something that like is just like more tangible, more achievable. Let's move out of the hypothetical. Let's real talk, right? And that's what Jesus is doing here. He's trying to move us out of the hypothetical and into the real circumstances, into the real people. Because this is where you find God. This is how you discover who God really is. Not in the hypotheticals, not in the maybes, not in the what ifs, not in the what about them questions. See, the better question that Jesus wants us to start asking ourselves is not what about them. Jesus wants us to ask this: what about me? Not what about them, not what about that situation, not what about that. No. What about me? Let's make it personal. He's the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, of real people who had real problems. See, Jesus wants to make it personal. With God, it's always personal. He wants us to ask, what about me? What's keeping me from faith? What's keeping me from giving God a chance? What's keeping me from being committed to Him? What is it about me? Not the hypotheticals, not them. What about me? Make it personal. And the reason we don't like to ask this question is that when you get down to it, the answer to this question of what really keeps us from God, the answer to this question is painful. It's a painful answer. It's a painful question. Because truthfully, what keeps most of us from faith is not understanding a logical problem or not understanding how things work. What keeps us from faith is really painful things that we've not addressed. Like for many of us, the reason that we don't want to give faith a chance, that we don't want to give God a chance in our lives, that we don't want to give church a chance, is because of a loss that we haven't grieved. The loss of a loved one that you can't believe it happened still and you're still reeling from it. And truthfully, you're mad at God about it. You're mad that happened. It's interesting how we can not believe in God and be mad at Him at the same time. There's undealt with pain. There's undealt with loss. Maybe it's the loss of a job, loss of a career opportunity, the loss of a relationship. And it hurts so deep that you know if you ask this question, what about me? And you know you make it personal with God and say, God, here's what's really keeping me from you. You know it's going to get too painful. It's like a scab that you don't want to pick off because you know you're going to bleed. And so we do whatever we can to just not go there, right? And for some of us, maybe it's not a loss. Maybe it's a regret that you're carrying with you, a mistake you made in the past that you've not been able to forgive yourself of, and you've spent your entire life trying to bury it so that no one knows, and so that you forget it. It's just too painful. And you know that if you got real with God, you know if you got real transparent and real vulnerable, you didn't ask the what about them questions, you made it personal, you know you'd have to deal with this painful part of your past. And it just hurts too much. And for some of us, it's not something we did, it's something that was done to us. It was something that wasn't even our fault. But we're just hurting and we haven't healed from it. And it's just something we just don't want to deal with. It's just way easier to point at other people's situations and use other people's problems and use other people's stories to stiff-arm God and say, what about them? It's just way easier because you don't have to deal with so much junk that's going on in your heart. And so we use other people's stories sometimes to prove our point. But let me just tell you, that's a dangerous business to get in. If you use other people's pain and other people's stories to prove your point, it's a dangerous, dangerous game. Because you don't know what someone else's story actually means to them. You don't know what that pain has actually done in their lives. See, what I've found and what many of us in the room have found is that on the other side of great pain and great tragedy and great heartache is great faith. That God actually meets you in the midst of some of your most difficult circumstances. You need to be careful about using someone else's story. I'll give you some of my stories as an example. All right? At 22 years old, my wife and I had been married for 6 months. And we made the decision to move to Seattle, Washington. We were living in Kentucky at the time. So, little Kentucky boy, Kentucky girl, saying, let's roll up a stake and go to Seattle. Let's do this. Got offered a great position at a church plant. I was fresh out of Bible college, wanting to tackle the world. Got offered to come on at a new church, a startup church, under a leader that I loved. And my wife and I both greatly admired. And we felt God calling us to it. Like, we prayed about it, and it was, yes, you need to go. So we pack up our stuff, we move across the country on this big adventure, and we're so excited. And fast forward 3 years later, and what was so exciting and what was initially so incredible resulted in the worst crash and burn of my life. Completely burnt out. Didn't want anything to do with faith. Didn't want anything to do with God. Didn't want anything to do with the church. I had lost my job because I couldn't handle it. I couldn't handle all the stress. I was too young in my relationship with God. I was too young in my growth as an individual to handle the load that was being given to me. I couldn't do it. I got to this place where I was just so depressed. I was burnt out. I couldn't feel anything. Like, as a feeler, as like an emotional guy sometimes, I couldn't feel joy. I didn't feel pain. I didn't feel sadness. I didn't feel happiness. It was the first time I'd ever dealt with depression. I didn't know what that was. And it wrecked me. I did things and said things to the people that I love that hurt them in that season. It was awful. It was horrible. And man, you could use my story to prove your point about why you don't give God a chance. You could. You could use my story to support your argument that the church is not worth your time. Honestly, you could say, like, look at what the church did to Petey. Chewed him up and spit him out. Left him burnt out, depressed, almost wrecked his faith, almost wrecked his marriage. Left him in counseling. Look at what the church did to Petey. See? That's why I won't give God a chance. You could use my story to say that this is why pastors can't be trusted. If that's your issue, you could use my story to say that. You could say, like, see, they're hypocritical. See, they're not all they're cracked up to be. See, they're fake. You could use my story to say this is why you shouldn't give Jesus a chance, because Jesus doesn't actually make your life better. See, it actually made Petey's life worse. You could use my story to support your point about why you are stiff-arming God. But you got to be careful, because that's not how I see it. Yeah, I was at lunch this past week with someone from our church and was telling them my story of faith and this part of my story. And he asked me at the end of it a question that almost everyone asks me after I tell them my story. The question that's most often asked is, do you regret going to Seattle? Like, now that you've done it, now that you can see it in hindsight, now that you know, if you could do it all over again, would you say no to that calling? Was it a mistake? And my answer is always no. Are you kidding me? Like that made me who I am. Like, going through that pain and going through that heartache and going through that depression and going through that misery and that suffering built my faith. It made me who I am today. I wouldn't trade it for the world. Do I have regrets from it? For sure. I wouldn't trade my story, though. I would not trade what I've been through for anything, because of what I've been through, nearly losing my marriage, nearly burning out of ministry, nearly giving up on God. Because of what I've been through, I fight for the health of my marriage and unity with my wife like never before. Because of what I've been through, I fight for my relationship with Jesus. During that season, the only thing that mattered to me was success. During those 3 years, the only thing that mattered to me was being successful as a pastor. That was my identity. It's what mattered the most to me. But because of going through that, I love y'all, but like, being a pastor is like 5th or 6th on my list of what's important to me. Like, I'm a follower of Jesus first and foremost. I'm a husband. I'm a father. I'm a friend. I'm a son. I got things that define me way more than being a pastor. And that wouldn't be the case had I not gone through that. See, because of what I've been through, I can relate to people when they say I suffer from depression. I go through depression. You have no idea how many doors that's opened for me. The minute they hear that someone hears a pastor went through depression, they're like, oh my gosh, I never heard that. I didn't know that. I just know that's what I've been through. And it's opened so many doors for me to use my story to help people that are coming through stories of brokenness. I wouldn't trade it all. I'm telling you, like, what hell meant to destroy me. Like what hell meant to break me. It failed. It failed because I brought God into it. I brought God into the equation. I didn't live in the theoretical. I didn't keep saying, what about them? I said, God, here's what I'm dealing with. Here's what I'm feeling. I'm going to get real with you, God. I'm going to get raw. I'm going to get vulnerable. I'm going to get transparent. I'm going to tell you exactly why I'm ticked at you. I'm going to tell you exactly why I don't want to keep doing this. I'm going to get real. I'm going to make it really, really, really personal. And when I invited God into that level, he built my faith stronger than it had ever been before. He met me there. And I'm telling you, if you want to know who God is, if you really want to discover God, get that real with him. Tell him why you don't believe in him. Tell him. Tell him why you're mad at him. Tell him why you doubt him. Tell him. He can handle it. You say, what about me? You get that real and that raw with God, and I promise you, he will meet you there. Because he is a father to you. That's the most frequent visual that the Bible gives us, is a father. We sing that he's a good father. He's a good father. He wants to walk alongside you in your mess. And he's like a good father, to the point that like he'll actually let you fall on your face. Because like parents in the room, you know that like one of the most important things you can do for your kids is like let them get hurt. Right? You let them fall, but then be there with them alongside them to pick them up and help them make sense of what's going on. Help them see that they're still safe. Help them see that they're still loved. He's a good father in that way. He wants to meet you there because here's the deal, y'all. The biggest thing you need to know, you are not a hypothetical to him. You're not hypothetical to God. You're not just like another number of the billions of people that live in this world. He created you. In the inmost parts of your being, he knit you together in your mother's womb. He knows you by name. He knows everything about you. He knows everything. He took into account your stupidity before you were ever born. He knows you. He loves you. He's crazy about you. Enough that he'd be willing to stretch out his arms and die for you. Because you're not a hypothetical to him. You are a son. You're a daughter to him. And God wants to meet you there, but you got to invite him in. You got to stop asking, what about them? You got to say, God, what about me? You got to get real with him. You got to get raw. And nobody can do that for you. That's between you and God. And so I want to give you some space to at least start that conversation with God. It ain't going to finish here because that's a long conversation. But I want to give you a chance to start talking to God about that. And ask him. Ask him these really hard questions. Invite him in. And I promise you, he'll meet you there. Let me pray for you. And I'm going to give you a chance to just kind of sit back and talk to God about it for a minute. Lord, we love you. And we're grateful that you loved us enough to die for us. We're grateful that we're not hypotheticals. That you know the intimate working details of every single person in this room right now. You know why they're mad at you. You know where they're hurting. You know everything about us, God. And so right now, I speak on behalf of the entire room, and we just say, we invite you in. We invite you in to help us process through the painful places, the difficult places of our lives. God, we want to be a church that's just real and raw, taking who we are and just coming before you as honest and transparent as we can. And we know that you'll honor that. We know that you'll meet us there. You've done it time and time again. And so God, I pray that you would meet us and that you would begin to help us process and that you would build great faith on the other side of this. God, I pray for the people in the room that don't even know if they believe in you right now. Meet them in these moments of quiet as we come before you. Meet us here, Father.